Hey, what's up guys? It's Pedro here from NoobCoder.com and welcome back to part 4 of my Tic Tac Toe GUI series. So we are going to be wrapping up this project within this tutorial. All we need to do is implement our initialize board method, our toggle player method, as well as our main method. So let's actually get started with our initialize board method. So we're going to start off with a nested for loop. So I'm going to say for int I is equal to 0 while I is less than 3, I++, and then we're going to stick another for loop within it. So I'm just going to copy that. And the reason why we're using a nested for loop is because the board is a two-dimensional array. So if you take a look here, you can see from our previous method, reset board, that board is a two-dimensional array. And essentially what initialize board is doing is we're going to go through this 2D array and we're going to instantiate J buttons and then add it to that array. And then you're going to see why in a second. So I'm just going to say J button btn is equal to new J button. And by default, if I don't pass in a string here, the J button does not have a name. So it's going to have an empty string like this. And that's exactly what I want, so I'm not going to pass in anything. Next, this next step is pretty much optional. You do not need to do it. So I'm going to say set font. And essentially this allows us to set the font. So I'm going to say font dot sans serif. That's the type of font that I want. I'm going to make it bold. That's the second argument. And the last argument, I'm going to make it size 100. So now that we have that, let's actually add this newly created J button onto our board. So I'm going to say board I sub J is equal to btn, which is the newly created button that we created. Next, we're going to add a action listener because a button without a listener is pretty much useless. So I'm going to say btn.add action listener, and we're going to use an anonymous class. And here in our action perform method, we're passing in a action event E. So this action event has a method called getSource. And is basically going to return who clicked me. So when the user clicks that button, it's basically going to return itself. Now, the problem with getSource is it returns a type object, but that's a little bit too vague for us. And in this case, we already know what type that object is. We can just say JButton. And essentially here, we're casting it into a J button because that's what it is. And now I'm going to wrap this whole thing up in parentheses. And now I can actually treat this as a J button, which it is. Now I can say .get text. And remember, this is a method from the J button. And now I can say .equals the empty string. Now, the reason I'm testing to see if it's an empty string is because I want to know if it's a valid move. I want to know if player X or player O can put their piece there. So this is essentially testing that. But there's one more condition that I want to be met. I want to know if there's a winner. Remember, we set up a field when we created the class. And if HasWinter is equal to false, then we do not have a winner. So this is a valid move. Now I'm going to wrap this whole thing up within an if statement. So I'm going to say if this whole thing is true, what do I want to do? Well, if this whole thing is true, that means I can put my piece there. So now I'm going to say btn.set text equal to the current player. So now I know that the current player can put their piece there. Next, we're going to call the HasWinter method. Now, I already went over the HasWinter method in a previous tutorial, but what you should take away from it is that we have a field called HasWinter, and it is initially set to false in our default constructor. Now, what the HasWinter does is it checks to see if we have a winner, and if we do have a winner, set this field to equal true. That means that this statement will no longer execute once we have a winner. Finally, we're going to use the toggle player method. Now, the toggle player method is pretty self-explanatory. Once we make our move, once we set the current player for that J button, I want you to toggle the player. So if X moves, now it is O's turn. If O moves, now it is X's turn. And finally, we need to add this button to the content pane. So I'm just going to say pane.add button. Finally, once we head to our toggle player, it's pretty self-explanatory. So I'm just going to do a simple if-else statement. If the current player, if I could spell player, dot equals X, what does that mean? Well, if the current player is equal to X, I want to set the current player equal to O. So we're getting a toggle effect. Else, that means if current player is not equal to X, then it has to be equal to O, which means I want to set it to X. So this looks good. So I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you in the next tutorial. Like, comment, subscribe.